I was just telling my colleagues earlier that I think we should underscore the importance of this kind of diverse audience. I usually have two kinds of audiences, my students or academic conferences. And usually at academic conferences, it's a bunch of political scientists talking to each other about how we really know the world is working. But here we have people who want to be practitioners and activists at the same time, so you're a real audience. And I remember last year being at the conference of the American Political Science Association, which is our largest conference, most prestigious, and getting into the elevator with a bunch of my colleagues, and then this elderly couple walks in and says, "What's going on?" And so I said, "Well, it is the annual conference of the American Political Scientists." And so I said, "How many are there of you?" She said, 30,000. So she looks at her husband and says, "Well, that's our problem." There's 30,000 and they're all talking to each other. Anyhow, so this is a really important audience, and so I really appreciate you for bringing this together and for inviting me to speak. I also have to make another confession, that this is the first time in my professional career I want to scrap my talk and talk to several points that have been highlighted already, but I won't do that. For the sake of the integrity of the conference, I'll talk what I wanted to talk about in the program, but I hope that, and this is a hint, that someone asked me, "Dalia, what do you think about Islamophobia?" And then we can talk about that later. Anyhow, so there's this growing phenomenon, this is the point of my talk, where I'm going to be talking about domestic politics and religion, but not here in the United States, in the Arab world. And so the title of my talk is Religion, Politics, and the Arab Spring. And that there's this growing phenomenon that occurred in the Arab world last year, symbolically that began with the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi that you mentioned, a Tunisian street vendor that came to symbolize a level of frustration in the Arab world that led to the fall of Zain al-Abidin bin Izzat in Tunisia, and signaled what is increasingly being seen as the fall of several repressive regimes in North Africa and throughout the Arab world. But the fascination with the causes and the images of the so-called Arab Spring that captivated us last year have been replaced with concerns over the implications of these moments, and the future of these states, and the nature of the political landscape, and the implications of these concerns on regional stability, and ultimately to our foreign policy. And so in my talk today, I'm going to focus on Egypt, but these remarks can really be applied to much of the places that have undergone revolutions or revolutionary moments in the past year. So since the start of the uprising in Egypt that began on January 25th of last year, and which ultimately led to the ouster of President Hosni Mubarak, one of the major questions being asked was, well, what about the Islamists? What about the Muslim Brotherhood? It seemed that one of the most pressing issues questions that policy analysts, foreign governments, the Egyptian people, and even Hosni Mubarak at the time were asking were really about the concern over Egypt if the Islamists were to win. What would Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood look like? An Islamist movement which is really the only organized opposition movement to the regime since Anwar Sadat. What would Egypt look like? What would it mean for minorities, for women? What would it mean for regional stability? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it seems that the Islamists have won, and not just in Egypt, but Tunisia as well. And for the past year, they've secured for themselves an elected majority in parliament, winning 47% of the seats, the speakership of the parliament under the Democratic Alliance, and a coalition led by the Freedom and Justice Party, the actual political party of the Muslim Brotherhood. And just last month, they won 58.8% of the seats in the Shura, or the upper house of parliament. So the hypothetical question of the past is now being tested. But the larger questions still revolve around the role of religion in politics and what is being called New Egypt. So the fear of religion is coming, well, it's here. But if you want to talk about the role of religion in New Egypt, you have to ask yourself, well, what was the role of religion in the past? What did old Egypt look like? And it's important for us to map this historical evolution and the role religion has played, because it's really important for us if we're going to understand the present context and the future, especially in terms of US foreign policy. And so very briefly, what I hope to do in the next couple of minutes is map out Egypt into five main circles, religious circles or religious categories. And the first circle or sphere is really the religious institutions, which is strange, as was mentioned earlier today, because when you think about the role of religion, in the technical sense, there's no hierarchy in Islam, right? There's no pope, there's no official religious institution. So how can we talk about religious institutions in Islam, especially in a country called Egypt? In the modern context, in Egypt today, and for the past couple of decades, the state controls religious institutions. It controls how they run. It controls how they're financed. And the great irony here is that the emergence of the modern state brought with it the emergence of religious institutions that were necessitated by the separation of church and state. So we see the establishment of religious Islamic institutions for the state to juxtapose itself against, but also to contain religion in. And so in Egypt they're contained in Al-Azhar, Dalia Fahmy, the fatwa issuing body in Egypt. And the second sphere is religion. Religion here is religion of the people, in their practice, in their day-to-day lives. And in Egypt this takes two primary forms. The collective practice of religion that's not guided, but it's personal, it's self-taught, it's in the day-to-day lives of individuals, and it's more of a social adherence. It's not regulated and it's not formal. And the second sphere of this practice is in the Sufi orders, of which 12 million of the 81 million Egyptians belong to. And they are much more organized. There's a Sufi council or a hierarchy within Sufism. And although they have internal conflicts, historically, they have always allied to the state. And usually these close ties were established under the previous administration of, or previous regime of Mubarak, where the higher council of Sufi orders would constantly pledge support to Mubarak through this religious oath, or a bay'ah. They would actually make bay'ah to Mubarak, a religious pledge of allegiance. The third manifestation of religion in Egypt is really in movements. And movements are those that don't manifest themselves in organizations. Movements are groups that include different groups outside of the legal domain. And they've been subject to a tense relationship with the state. These groups include Jama'at Islamiyya, Islamic Jihad, which even if some of the members don't believe in violence, that kind of sentiment still exists in those kinds of movements. These groups are returning today. They're forming political parties and trying to enter into the legal fold. And although some of them have not yet officially joined the political process, they are having internal elections to consider their future involvement in politics. And this is really interesting because if you think about the nuances of these movements, they're antithetical to politics, right? They've always seen political participation as antithetical to what they believe. So here they are now entering the political fold, really undermining what they have been propagating for decades. The fourth sphere, and this is the most interesting sphere for us, is Islamist parties. And I count the Muslim Brotherhood not as a movement, but as a party because it has a hierarchy, a structure, a vision, an ideology. They function as a party. They've been a part of the democratic process since the 80s and have established themselves as the strongest political party and for a very long time in opposition to the Mubarak regime. The fifth sphere, very briefly, is the intellectual trend. And through academics, pundits, discussions just like this one, talking about the future of religion in Egypt and what the role of religion should be. And the emergence and re-emerging of Muslim voices in the public space is leading to bigger discussions and bigger debates outside of what traditionally we've thought about as religion in the public. So that's the history. So when we talk about religion in the time of the revolution that just happened, there's often this collective sigh of relief that exists among the Egyptians. Phew. This was not the Iranian Revolution. It wasn't a religious one, right? There was a spiritual element. The slogans were loaded with religious notations, prayers were held regularly, and religious passion was on all sides. If you remember the images, crosses were being displayed just as prominently. Religion was not a factor of division on purpose, where there was on-purpose semblance of unity in faith. In the slogans being chanted and songs that were emerging were that the people would not let the state use religion to divide the population, even among secularists, but that religion or religious diversity would unite the population. So what was the main goal of Tahrir Square or Liberation Square? Was it simply the ouster of Mubarak? Rather, no. If you remember in the beginnings of the revolution, it was against the succession of authority from Mubarak to his son Gamal. And so at the start of the revolution, there's this discussion about reinstating the republic, to reinstate what it means to be a republic, or even the establishment of a second republic. However, these calls were very quickly drowned out by the calls for change and overthrow. The revolution brought together people of all walks of life. people calling for democracy, for social justice, for economic freedom, because in the decade up to the revolution, most of the opposition was being led by who? The labor movement, the Kifaya movement, youth activism, and they've been engaging in this discourse on the republic for decades. So we're not talking here in terms of religion and the republic about Salafis coming to take over, where you see Orthodox Muslims with long beards coming on TV, and we're scratching ourselves saying, is this the future of the Republic? No, we're talking about the discourse, where the role of religion is being discussed in the future of Egypt, much like they were at the start in Tahrir Square. So this notion of religion in the public was short-lived. We saw it manifest itself in the debate on the Constitution and the debate on the referendum. Most people saw the role of religion in the future of Egypt as a guide for public morality. This was the discussion during the revolution, as a philosophy for the public that was guided by the culture of Egypt, where the question of Egypt as an Arab or African or Islamic culture was how religion was going to come to be defined in the public sphere. So they see religion in the public sphere, but not in the sphere of governance. So why does this happen? Why is it that when we think about political opposition in Egypt or politics in Egypt today or much of the Arab and Muslim world, we think of Islamists and wonder,